was to write a history of the Ozarks. I thought it was going to be a one-volume, maybe a big fat book on the history of the Ozarks. By the time I got the story to the Civil War, and I hadn't even written my chapter on slavery. I hadn't written my chapter on, the rest on the Civil War. I already had this. I had a book-length manuscript by the time I got to the Civil War. So I was able to talk the University of Illinois Press into the crazy idea that the world needed a 3-volume history of the Ozarks. So here we go. This is Volume 1. Volume 2 will be out next month. I think the 16th is the official release date for Volume 2, so it's right around the corner. And Volume 3 is the bane of my existence right now. I'm still trying to finish it, and I'm starting to think I may have to retire in order to finish Volume 3. There's a lot of, the closer you get to the present, the more stuff there is, the more information there is, the more research materials there are. And, when you're back before the Civil War, and this is all pre-Civil War stuff, you pretty much just got to use whatever you can find, because it's hard to come by, especially when you're researching a region like the Ozarks that didn't leave behind just a whole lot of written records, and you got to be a little bit resourceful finding your information. But it's been fun. I am a native of the Ozarks. I grew up about not quite an hour and a half west of here, over in Ozark County. Some of you know where Ozark County is. So where I'm from, Pocahontas was a big town. There was the one thing I knew about Pocahontas when I was a kid. My grandpa always talked about it because it was the last place he brought his cotton to be ginned. It was when all the gins closed down way over in the hills over there. This was the place. Now there was one down around Batesville, but apparently he brought his over here for the last year or two that he grew cotton in the '60s, and then everybody gave up on it at some point in the hills. But let's talk a little bit about the old Ozarks today. And if you don't know exactly where the map of the Ozarks is, here's a map of what geographers define as the Ozarks. And here I'm talking about the dotted line here is the outline of the Ozarks. It's roughly 45,000 square miles or so. Not quite as big as the state of Arkansas. It's about the size of the state of New York, close to the size of the state of New York. So it's a pretty big region. And again, this is the physical Ozarks. And what that means is just because you fall within the dotted lines doesn't mean that you necessarily consider yourself part of the Ozarks. We know Pocahontas is right there on the line. It's not on the map here, but it's on the line. Black River is a good dividing line for the eastern part of the Ozarks. You hop over into the Black Country and back into the hills, pretty much wherever Black River is in this part of the world. And when you get farther up into the northern part of the Ozarks, especially up here in the Missouri Valley and along the Mississippi Valley, most of the people who live up there would not consider themselves Ozarkers. They would not affiliate with us. So that's so what I mean by that is that there's a physical Ozarks, and then there's a cultural Ozarks. And the cultural Ozarks is more about how you identify with a region. Volume 1 pretty much deals with the physical Ozarks because no one in the pre-Civil War days really thought of themselves as an Ozarker anyway. That wasn't really a thing. That's more of a 20th century creation, the idea of the Ozarks and what it means to be in the Ozarks and the hillbilly sort of stereotype and all that kind of stuff that goes with it. That's a more modern creation. So what I did with Volume 1 was I just did pretty much a history of what falls within those dotted lines and how it relates to the rest of North America, and eventually to the rest of the United States when we get into that territory. So there we are. Now what we're going to talk about tonight, I just picked out 3 topics that we'll talk about quickly. any good sermon has, what 3 points? The magic of the number 3, I think, is what you're supposed to stick with. So we're gonna talk about the legendary Scots-Irish of the Ozarks, and look at how that has become a way that a lot of people have identified the heritage of the Ozarks, and we'll look and see how much truth, how much legend that has to it. We'll look at the early days of the Ozarks, talking about the accounts of the first settlers who actually wrote down their experiences, and talk about the natural world that they encountered, which is something that I had a lot of fun writing about as someone who grew up on a farm in a rural area. I like talking about nature and animals and all that kind of stuff. And the Ozarks was a very different place 200 years ago and more than it is today. And so we'll talk about that a little bit, and then we'll talk about one neat story of what I call the immigrant Indians, the ones who were settled in the Ozarks but were not originally from here, and their efforts to establish their own nation here in the Ozarks, which obviously did not come to fruition, but we'll talk a little bit about that. So 3 different stories from the old Ozarks. And the first one actually involves Randolph County, or it wasn't Randolph County in those days, it was still Lawrence County at that time. But my one real but somewhat tenuous connection to Randolph County is a family by the name of Shaver. My 6th, I think it's 6th. Well, you get that far back, it doesn't matter. I think it just, they all kind of blend together. But my 6th great-grandfather, a fellow by the name of John Shaver, settled here in what today is Randolph County a little over 200 years ago. And as far as I know, his wife was already deceased by the time he came here with an extended family. I don't know if there are any Shavers left today. I guess somebody's shaking their head, so I guess there's some Shavers around here. But this was his son, or one of his sons, not my ancestor, but one of his other sons, Jacob Shaver, and we're going to talk a little bit about Jacob Shaver in a minute. But first we're going to talk about the Scots-Irish. Now, beginning about 40 years or so ago, historians started to kind of rewrite the history of the Ozarks and sort of redefine the early days of the Ozarks as an age of the Scots-Irish. Now, you know who the Scots-Irish are? If you're a genealogist, you probably have Scots-Irish ancestries. Who they are people who came to America, most of the ones that we're talking about before the Revolutionary War, but many of them after the Revolutionary War as well. But they came to America from Northern Ireland. And they were in Northern Ireland because the English had planted them there. They were Protestants who were originally from Scotland and Northern England and even a few from Wales. They had been planted in Northern Ireland to try to subdue what the English called the Wild Irish. And those were the Catholic Irish. That was England, being a Protestant nation, had major problems with the Irish Catholics. And so they established a sort of Protestant beachhead in Northern Ireland. And we all remember this because if you remember back in the days before 9/11, you don't have to go too far back into the 90s and certainly in the 80s and the 70s, when terrorism popped up on the 10 o'clock news, it was usually something to do with the Irish, the Protestants and the Catholics fighting each other. And those problems stemmed all the way back to the early 1600s when this project, this experiment took place. Well, in the early 1700s and all the way up to the Revolutionary War, thousands of those Ulster Irish, the Northern Irish that we now call the Scots-Irish, came to America by the droves, just bunches and bunches and bunches of them. And many of them headed into the back country of Pennsylvania and into Virginia and Maryland and down into the Carolinas. And eventually their descendants ended up in places like the Appalachian Mountains and the Ozarks and a lot of other places. And so about 40 years or so ago, scholars started to sort of redefine the Ozarks as the place of the Scots-Irish. And that didn't just mean that these were just people from Northern Ireland who had come to the Ozarks. It had a certain connotation with it. And when you talked about the Scots-Irish, you were talking about moonshining and fiddle music and people who like to fight, even more than they like to drink. And all of these, and there were lots of the image of the Scots-Irish before the Civil War kind of fit the hillbilly image that the Ozarks had. And so a lot of historians drafted that and said, well, we know how Ozarks people end up. We've been around them. They're hillbillies, right? So these had to have been their ancestors, these Scots-Irish people. They fit the pattern, and now we figured it out. And pretty much any book that's been written about the Ozarks in the last 40 years has incorporated that idea of this is the land of the Scots-Irish. And so one of the things I did with this book is I tried to figure out how important the Scots-Irish were to early Ozarks history. How do we even know what the ethnicity was of all these many, many people who come to the Ozarks, many of them second or third or fourth generation North American born? What does it all mean? And one of the best things I came across, and this is in that old Randolph County history book that many of you have. I don't. What's the author's name? I just forgot. Dalton. Yeah, Dalton's history book. Now he talks about this celebration and barbecue for the 45th anniversary of the Declaration of Independence. Some of you remember that from that book. 1821. They're around Fusher Thomas area. And is that how you say it? Foshi? Foshi. Foshi, okay. And they're having a barbecue and a celebration, and they raise a big liberty pole and all this kind of stuff. The reason I have Jacob Shaver up there, he's the Grand Marshal of the parade. I can't imagine this was a huge parade. In 1821, there weren't all that many people here, and if everyone showed up, it probably still wasn't a very big parade. But Jacob Shaver was the Grand Marshal of the parade. There was another local by the name of Daniel Plott, and some of you remember coming across him, I'm sure. He's the one who very dramatically read the Declaration of Independence. And that was a long-standing tradition for generations when we would have July 4th celebrations where someone would get up and read the entire Declaration of Independence. It's not that long. In our short attention span age today, we would be passing out before somebody got to the end of it. But in those days, what else did you have to do but listen to somebody read the Declaration? So Daniel Plott read the Declaration, and there was another guy, Jacob Shaver's brother-in-law, Matthias, or Matthias perhaps, I'm going to say, he probably has anglicized it to Matthias Malk, who was in charge of the barbecue. So these three men were sort of the three leading figures in this 45th anniversary Declaration of Independence celebration, and all three of them were of German descent. And it was one of those things that just kind of hit me over the head that, we sometimes we try to oversimplify stories, and I think part of what that Scots-Irish thesis does, it sort of oversimplified the story of the Ozarks, and it obscures a lot of the other people who were here. Randolph County is a good place to talk about those other people, because in the early days of what would eventually become Randolph County, you had people of French descent. We know they were here. You had these people of German descent. You did have people of Scots-Irish descent. You had people of African descent. You had people of just about every sort of descent that you could find on the North American continent. And even a few, most likely, of Native American descent still hanging around or having married into families and things like that. So what you had was really, and a good example here in early Randolph County, or Lawrence County as it still was at that time, of this melting pot that really was the upland South. And by upland South, I mean Appalachia and the Ozarks, and eventually we could even include the hill country of Texas in that. But these these places were all connected because so many of the early settlers here in the edge of the Ozarks and farther into the Ozarks came from places back east in the mountains or in the hill country of East Tennessee, Middle Tennessee, in parts of Kentucky and the Carolinas. And these people came from a variety of backgrounds. They weren't just the Scots-Irish, even though there is that temptation to try to simplify the story and find a neat little group who match our modern hillbilly stereotypes. I'm pretty sure some of these Germans match our modern hillbilly stereotypes. A lot of these people, by the time they got to a place like Arkansas, many of them were second or third generation born. The Shavers, originally the Schaefers, had been in North America for over 100 years by the time they had that Declaration of Independence. So they were among the earliest of the German immigrants to what would become the United States. And they ended up here. Jacob Shaver ultimately decided that Randolph County wasn't the place for him, and he moved over to around the Fayetteville area, and then eventually ended up down in the Arkansas River Valley before many of his descendants made the trek to California, which was a pretty typical story. But he spent the rest of his life in Arkansas. But again, this is, you can obviously make way too much of just one little anecdote, but it is a good story for sort of doing away with that notion that the Ozarks was just settled by the good old whiskey drinking, moonshine. Well, you know, and we got to appreciate the fiddle music and the ballads and all that kind of stuff that they brought over. The Scots-Irish were real, and they were important. They just weren't the only story, as we've sometimes been told for the last few years. Okay, our second little story we've got, and this one involves the natural Ozarks. And as I said, this was fun for me. One of the things I did as I started doing the research several years ago for this book is I would just keep up with like wildlife stories, and because almost all of the early settlers who left accounts, almost all of the early explorers would talk about the wildlife that they came into contact with. And what I noticed was that so much of it is not here anymore. And it's mainly because of us. It's because of our ancestors who did away with so much of the wildlife that they wrote about in those early days. And one perfect example is the elk. There were elk that were indigenous to the Ozarks when the earliest settlers got here. They were called the eastern elk. They are now extinct. The elk that have been brought back into the Ozarks, both up on the Current River in southeast Missouri and down on the Buffalo River here in Arkansas, are the Rocky Mountain elks. They're a slightly different species than the elks that were here at the time. But there are all kinds of accounts of elks, and early settlers encountering herds of elks, and sometimes killing elks. Or in one case, I read an account of a young man from Ohio who came into the Ozarks in the 1840s, and he encountered a big herd of elks and shot and injured one of them. And I, just sort of, got mad at him for not finishing the job there. But, you get one shot and then they're gone back in those days. But there are all kinds of stories. Schoolcraft mentions elks in his account. And there seemed to be one particular place in the Ozarks that was kind of the haven, the last refuge for elks. And some of you have been to this place. If you've ever driven to Springfield on US 60, you've driven pretty much right through it. If you drive between Willow Springs and Kabul, you drive through this kind of high country where you can see a long ways in different directions. There's not much out there. Used to be a truck stop, and it went out of business a few years ago. And this was the area, this kind of high country, where all these streams start. It's kind of a watershed place where the North Fork of the White River starts up in there. The 11 Point starts up in there. Summers. You got the Big Piney and these rivers that go north as well that start there. in this high country, and that's where a lot of the elks were spotted. That was the great haven for these eastern elks. And there was one legend that I absolutely loved. I came across. There's a county in Missouri called Texas County. If you've ever been to Houston, Missouri, that's the seat of Texas County. It makes sense, right? It's easy to remember. They did that on purpose. And Texas County Texas County goes all the way down to Cabul, is in the southern edge of Texas County. And there's a little community in Texas County to this day called Elk Creek. And around Elk Creek there lived this settler before the Civil War by the name of Duke. And as with a lot of these stories that get passed down in local history, you sort of have to take it with a grain of salt, or a whole shaker of salt sometimes with these things. But it was such a good story. This fellow by the name of Duke, as the story goes, had captured a bunch of elk calves. And I guess is that what you call it? A young elk calf? Elk calves, and had trained them to be a team, to pull a wagon. And the story goes that Duke actually had a team of elks that would pull his wagon. And when he would go into Houston on court day, it would scare all the regular teams. They would take off running in all directions, and you can imagine what Duke would have looked like. And I always pictured Duke as this sort of Ozark Santa Claus in the old day. He's except he's got a wagon instead of a sleigh, and he's got elk instead of reindeer. But he must have really been quite a sight to see come riding into town. And of course, this is a legend that may or may not be true. And for years, I just assumed that it was just a fun story that people told each other, and it couldn't possibly be true. But not long ago, I actually came across a picture, not of Duke. This is too far back in the past, before the Civil War, but of a guy in Colorado who had a buggy hooked to a team of elks. And these elks were these bull elks, big, antlers and everything, were pulling this little buggy behind them. And I thought, well, there you go. Duke could have. That may not have just been a tall tale that someone told at the feed mill or at the sawmill, and it got passed down all these years. And so I really hope that Duke and his elk team did exist, to the point that I actually used them at the beginning of one of the chapters in there. But letting the reader know that this is legend, and there's no way to verify this. But it's a way to get underneath the story of the old Ozarks, to find the old Ozarks that isn't here anymore. The old Ozarks of elks. The last known elk was killed in the Ozarks in the 1880s. You wouldn't have thought they were around that long, would you? In Texas County, Missouri, the 1880s. There were still native elks up there, but they're gone now. And we know from early stories that there were bison, there were buffalo in the early Ozarks, and they moved on. They didn't stay here as much as they did on the plains, but they would seasonally come into the Ozarks, especially in the river bottoms, and graze. But once the Ozarks started to become very heavily populated, they didn't visit as much as you might expect them to. We know that the early settlers talked a lot about wolves, and many of them were just simply obsessed with killing wolves. Some of this, I think, probably extends back to old deeply ingrained European fears of wolves. You think of all the wolf stories we have in our folklore and our children's stories. And people would just do absolutely terrible, terrible things to wolves. I've read stories of people of skinning wolves alive, of capturing wolves and cutting the tendons on their back legs, and then having them fight, packs of dogs and stuff like that. And part of it we can just say, well, our ancestors were cruel and vicious people, and they could be, certainly, and part of it was probably economic. Wolves were very destructive on livestock, and so this was a major concern in a place that relied heavily on hogs running out on the free range and on cattle on the free range, And wolves did more destruction to livestock because they're pack hunters. They work together. Then they did more destruction than the painters did. Who knows what a painter was? A panther, right? A panther. The old Ozarkers always referred to them as painters. We don't like short vowel sounds in old Ozarks language, so they became painters. And I do have here's my painter here, and biologists tell us that there are no the painters are actually cougars. They're mountain lions. They're not actually panthers. And they tell us that there are no black cougars. And so the stories, of course, all the stories are of black panthers. But who knows what? I'm not a biologist, so I won't get into that debate. There's plenty of other stuff I can talk about. And a lot of the stories those early stories had to do with other animals that are now extinct, but that were prolific in the early days of settlement. On the left, you've got the passenger pigeon. And there are so many stories of the passenger pigeon, and they're just really, really intriguing stories of these birds that traveled in flocks of, it's been estimated in flocks of like 1 billion birds, if you can imagine that. The flocks of them were so large and so heavy that they would black out the sky. They would blot out the sun for hours at a time as they flew over. They would crack limbs off of large trees when they roosted in the evening. And they would come into the Ozarks a couple times of the year, and one of the times they would come in was in the spring of the year. And in years where people had had a particularly hard winter, the passenger pigeon was sort of like manna from heaven coming into the Ozarks, because the story was that these flocks would fly so low to the ground and they were so thick that you could just take a rock and fling it into and kill a bird. And when they roosted, I've read stories of settlers just taking sticks and going to the trees that they roosted and beating a bunch of them to death and bringing them back and eating them. And so I'm sure it did just seem like, well, these were sent by God to save us from at the end of this terrible winter, before the poke salad comes out, or whatever they're waiting on at that point. And the pigeon became such a central character in early Ozarks life that the young pigeons were called squabs. And the word squabby came to be applied. Of course, they were plump, little, how kind of chubby, fuzzy little birds are. They're cute and fun to eat at the same time again. But the term squabby came to be applied to little chubby kids. I don't know if any of you remember anyone using that term, squabby, but that comes from the passenger pigeon. It comes from this tradition of looking for those plump little squabs in the passenger pigeon flocks. Does anybody know what the birds on the right are?
Carolina parakeet.
Yeah, the Carolina parakeet. The most colorful bird in the old Ozarks, and there are lots of accounts as well of early settlers encountering these Carolina parakeets and describing how colorful they were. They were basically a tropical bird living in a what do you call it? What do we call it? Semi-tropical, subtropical. Well, anyway, we're not tropical, but these were tropical-looking birds living in a place that's not the tropics, and so they got a lot of attention, as did ivory-billed woodpeckers and animals like that. But certainly, probably more stories about bears than anything else, and Arkansas became the bear state. Bear hunting was an industry in the days before the Civil War. There were places where bear hunters congregated, and of course they not only used bear meat for food, but would render the fat into bear oil, which could be turned into candles and used for lighting and things like that. And that's how, reportedly, that's how oil trough, Arkansas, which is downriver from Batesville, got its name. It was a place where these handmade oil troughs that they used to render the fat into oil in would wash up on the banks there at oil. The oil trough is it's the first town in the bottomlands once you get out of the hills, and that's where the river widens and flattens out and sort of muddies up and gets gummy and all that kind of stuff. And that's where the troughs would come down out of the Ozarks, and they would settle after the flood waters had receded. They would settle on the banks, and so oil trough became oil trough. And some of you have probably been to the oil trough. And our last story, and I just learned, or at least I'm told that I've been mispronouncing this guy's name, which is not surprising. I don't know how the Shawnee pronounce names, but a friend of mine who is writing a play that involves this fellow just told me a few weeks ago that the emphasis is supposed to be on the second syllable. I've been calling him Quatawapia, which is, well, I don't know what emphasis, but it's supposed to be Quatawapia. This is how my friend says a Shawnee. He actually contacted the Shawnee to find out how to pronounce his name. So this is Quatawapia, and our last story involves him as sort of a central character. And it involves the group that I call the immigrant Indians. We know the story of early American history, in large part, is the story of people pushing Native Americans on in front of them, surrounding them, taking their land, the U.S. government sort of forcing natives into treaties and pushing them on farther west. And in the late 1700s and early 1800s, the Ozark region became one of the great dumping grounds for these unwanted immigrant Indians. There were Cherokees, we know, who came into Arkansas. Most of them stayed down in the Arkansas River Valley, but they had, as you can see here, this was the Cherokee land grant or land cession in the early 1800s. Everything, and most of that is the Ozarks in there. There were Kickapoos who came. There were Shawnees. There were Delawares. There were Pias and Peorias and all these different nations and tribes who were pushed out of their lands east of the Mississippi and landed somewhere in the Ozarks. And I have just a few of those on this map. And this is a map from the book that kind of shows roughly where a lot of these landed. You can see one of the things that the Cherokees would do is they would invite other Indian groups to settle on their land in Arkansas because the Cherokees were almost constantly at war with the Osages. The Osages were the original Native Americans who were here when the first Europeans came. And the Osages claimed the Ozarks as their hunting ground. They considered it their territory. And when these immigrant Indians started to settle in the Ozarks, fights broke out and wars broke out between them. And the Cherokees would invite their allies, the Shawnees and Delawares and people like that, to settle on their land to sort of be a buffer between them and the Osages. And so there was just almost constant fighting in the early 1800s between the Osages, the old lords of the realm in this area, and these newcomers. By the 1820s, it's estimated that there were probably close to 10,000 of these immigrant Indians just in the White River Valley alone, above Batesville, extending up to about the Branson area, somewhere in there. There were that many of them, and as many as a dozen different tribes they represented. And that's not even counting the natives who were scattered around the rest of the region. So Quatawapia, who was a Shawnee, and a Cherokee by the name of Tekatoka, and I'm probably mispronouncing that one. I'll find that out in a couple weeks when somebody informs me I've been saying that one wrong. But Quatawapia, Tekatoka, they got together on White River somewhere above Batesville and had sort of a conference with the leaders of these various tribes that were living on the river. And they decided, we want to make our stand here, and by that we don't mean we want to fight it out here. This is not going to be Wounded Knee or something like that. What we want to do is convince the white man's government that this should be our land. And if they will just leave us alone and give us autonomous control over this hill country area that we find ourselves in the middle of, we will continue to civilize ourselves and basically live like our white neighbors. That's what they decided to promise the U.S. government. So Quatawapiya and Teketoka actually travel to St. Louis and meet with William Clark. And that's William Clark of Lewis and Clark fame. William Clark was the U.S. Indian agent, and he was headquartered out of St. Louis, which was sort of the western edge of the United States at that time, still in the 1820s. And so they go and meet with William Clark, and William Clark was very receptive to their message. He thought it was a good idea if they just kind of cordoned off a big section of what today is Arkansas and Missouri and said, okay, this is an autonomous Indian nation. And he said, it sounds good to me, why don't you go on to Washington, D.C. and talk to the folks there? And so, unfortunately, Teketoka actually died before he could make the trip to Washington, D.C., but Quatawapiya made the trip. On the way out, he visited his Shawnee kinsmen who were still living back east on the Ohio River, and he tried to convince them of his vision for a land in the West, and he tried to convince them to finally give up their lands, to get away from the white settlers who were encircling them, and move out to Arkansas where he lived, and go with me in this plan. And so he went on to Washington, D.C. from there, and he met with the President-elect, John Quincy Adams. And remember, in those days, we had like a 4-month period between the fall election and the time the president took over. And he shows up in the winter before the new president had taken over. He met with the President-elect John Quincy Adams. He met with the Vice President-elect John C. Calhoun. Adams thought it was a good idea. The president actually thought this was a good idea. But in the end, John C. Calhoun, who was a Southerner and who had much more political pull in a place like Arkansas and Missouri, John C. Calhoun said, part of this sounds like a good idea. The part of it that has your brethren leave their homelands in the east and move west of the Mississippi River, that sounds like a good idea. The part about giving you an autonomous nation west of the Mississippi does not sound like a good idea, so we're not going to do that. And as it turns out, Quatawapiya's vision would have been shot down by his own brethren anyway, because on the way back from Washington, D.C. To Arkansas, he stopped in Ohio to gauge their reaction to his vision, and they said, no thanks, we're going to stay here, not knowing that within a few years they would be forced to leave their homelands anyway. And that was something that Quatawapiya could see. I mean, he knew what was coming, and he was trying to sort of get ahead of the game and establish this autonomous nation. So it came very close to having the Ozarks be an autonomous Indian nation. It didn't happen, but what did happen just a few years later is the U.S. government created an Indian territory in what we know as Oklahoma. And that was in the 1830s, and it was directly inspired by Quatawapiya's vision of an autonomous Indian nation and his discussion with figures in Washington, D.C., who turned around a few years later and then actually kind of put his plan into effect, but just farther west than he envisioned. And as a matter of fact, part of the Ozarks, as we saw on our map earlier, part of the Ozarks is Cherokee territory in northeastern Oklahoma. The Ozarks does extend into that part of Oklahoma. So at least a little part of the Ozarks would eventually become Indian territory, just not in the way that Quatawapiya envisioned it. But that's the third and last of my stories of the old Ozarks. And I would be glad to take questions about the old Ozarks or the new Ozarks or any Ozarks you want to talk about.
correct in saying what I've been saying to people when I'm out of state? That we are right now on the first hill of the Ozarks. As we come off of, as we come out of Black River, we're
Right.
on the first.
This is it.
Well, you're on one of the first hills.
One of the first ridges.
Right. Yeah. You're on. Of course, if you go back to our map, obviously, if you're talking about the farthest east, then you're over here somewhere around Cape Girardeau. But yeah, you're certainly.
We're in Arkansas at this point.
Right. Yeah. You're.
Yeah. I get your point.
Right. In this part of the state. Yeah.
You cross Black River,
Right.
you are immediately.
Yeah, this is where the Ozarks start.
Right
Yeah,
here.
this is the hill country.
Yeah. In this region of the lower region of the Ozarks.
That's right. That's right. Yeah, that's and it's really Black River is really a handy thing because it very clearly tells us when we are in and when we are not in the Ozarks, or when we are in or not in the flat country. Where I'm from, we always call it the bottoms. I don't know if that's what.
We call it here too.
Okay, the flat country was the bottoms, and that's where folks went to pick cotton back in the days. That's kind of.
Them hillbillies came down and picked our cotton.
That's right. Yeah, and you're talking about my grandparents and my parents. My mother. It always, as a kid, I always wanted to know where people were born, and it's probably I kind of had that in my veins, I guess, at some point. But my mom was born in Harrisburg, and it always used to confuse me because we never went to Harrisburg, and we didn't have any kinfolk in Harrisburg. And when I got older, my mom told me that my grandparents were down there picking cotton. And my grandma had my mom when they were, it was in October, it was cotton picking season. And my mom was born in Harrisburg when my grandma was 18 years old. And I think picked cotton up until like 2 days before my mom was born. Well, she may have, she may have, but, and so that was always something that was confusing to me when I was a kid. But yeah, a lot of the hillbillies did go down and pick cotton and do other sorts of things down there as well. Yeah. Yeah. And some of them had their own cotton, but it had to wait until they got back. Yeah. Somebody had a hand up.
Does your book talk about the geology of the Ozarks?
Yeah. Yeah, I'm right. It does in a very limited way. I'm obviously not a geologist, and so I'm on. Well, that'd be a bad pun. Say I'm on shaky ground. I'm not talking about geology, but I do talk about geology and the creation of the Ozarks. There are a couple pages there, sort of the natural history of the Ozarks, how it was created and why it looks different than the areas around it, and it's a very old land mass, much older than the areas around it. And actually, the oldest part of the Ozarks, as geologists say, is over 1 billion years old, close to 1.5 billion years old, and that is up in southeastern Missouri. It's the core of the old what used to be the mountains of the Ozarks. If you go up into the territory around Tomsauk Mountain in Ironton, Missouri, up in that area, it's what passes for mountains in Missouri. It's not very impressive, but Tomsauk is the highest point in Missouri, and that's the core of what once were mountains that were probably 10,000 feet high, or something like that. And that's what's left of it, because they're what, about 4 times as old as the Appalachian Mountains. So if you live long enough, the Appalachians will, they'll wear down too. Yeah, we just got to make it a few 100 million more years, and we'll be doing good.
So I have a research question, because like our family was forced down from Pilot Knob, Ironton.
During the Civil War?
Yes.
Centerville?
Yes.
Yeah.
And then our relative had to burn one of the courthouses, you know. So, from a research standpoint, when you're going up in that area and you've got Potosi listed, and the grandmother was from that area, which is a big Scott-Irish settlement.
Right.
Gibson's.
Right.
Where's your best research center up there?
Up there, I don't know locally. I don't know if there is a really good one. The best research centers in Missouri are going to be probably affiliated with the State Historical Society, and the closest one of those to here is going to be in Cape.
Okay.
That's going to be, they just recently, in the last 5 or 6 years, established a branch of the State Historical Society there. There's one in Rolla as well, but Cape Girardeau is the one that kind of does southeastern Missouri.
Okay.
And the way that the State Historical Society works is that any of the branches can get you anything from any of the other branches or from the main building in Columbia. It's kind of a network. We have one in Springfield as well, but it's kind of a network. And then the Missouri Historical Society in St. Louis is a really good source for Eastern Missouri history as well.
The library in Potosi has a basement full of old records.
And okay, so in Potosi, the library, yeah. So that's if you, yeah, and
it's another question.
sure.
Yeah, in conjunction with some of our local research on the early settlements up on the William Looney and that group, we have learned, or we believe anyway, that he and that movement, that they were involved in introducing non-plantation slavery into present-day Randolph County. And I wondered if you would comment on that, and also on other introduction of, say, non-plantation slavery in other areas of the Ozarks.
Sure. That I get in my volume 2 that's coming out next month. I actually have an entire chapter on slavery in the Ozarks, which is something that has very rarely been written about because, again, part of the kind of myth of the Ozarks is that it's a place where that just hasn't had many black people, and that it's a place that didn't have many slaves. But that's just not true. We know if you look at inside the dotted line, at the time of the Civil War, there were more than 30,000 slaves who lived somewhere inside this divided line. Now, obviously, the greatest number of them lived along the river valleys, where there was some limited plantation slavery, even up in what's called the Little Dixie area of Missouri, which had the heaviest concentrations of slave ownership in the state. But even in other places, you had significant numbers of enslaved people at the time of the Civil War. Greene County, Missouri, which is where Springfield is. And Springfield is not a place that people think of when you think of racial diversity, I'm pretty sure. Springfield was over 10% slave at the time of the Civil War. Greene County was. Springfield was much higher than that, because what you find, and you mentioned non-plantation slavery, the vast majority of slaves in the Ozarks were non-plantation slaves because there was very little plantation agriculture in the Ozarks. But the slaves, many of them were skilled workers. You would have blacksmiths, you would have carpenters, you would have masons, you would have seamstresses, you would have all these skilled slaves, because they actually earned money for their owners. That's how, instead of using slaves to work in the fields, many slave owners made their money by hiring them out to people. And if you taught your slave some sort of skill, like blacksmithing or something like that, they were much more valuable. And the way that worked is you would send them to work for somebody, and whoever hired them would actually pay the slave owner. And then if the slave owner decided he could he could give the slave part of the money if he wanted to do that, and there are instances where that happened, but he certainly didn't have to do that. And one of the best sets of records we have for that, not too far from Rolla, Missouri, there was a big iron foundry before the Civil War, the Merrimack Iron Company, and it was the first big iron foundry established west of the Mississippi River. And in the 1830s and 40s, Merrimack tried to do a lot of their work by using hired slaves, and there are still records of what they fed the slaves, what they paid the slave owners, and all this kind of stuff that kind of gives us an insight into how industrial slavery worked and how slavery worked in a place like the Ozarks, where you just didn't have cotton plantations, you didn't have tobacco plantations and stuff like that. But certainly, as I said, in Volume 2, I really fleshed this out and look at slavery, and I think, and we probably heard this as well, and I think it's, from my research, I think it's a myth, the myth of the sort of more benign, better slavery in the hills. You know, that's something that you hear, and I've seen it in history books. Well, because there were so few slaves, they were better treated in the hill country, and there's no evidence to back that up. And one of the psychological, I guess you might say, that kind of unexplored psychological sides of that is so many of the slave owners in the Ozarks just owned a single slave. And you think of the psychological ramifications of being an enslaved person and being the only one on a farm. And so you don't even have that community to sort of, to fall back on. And in Volume 2, I talk about the very high percentage in a lot of these counties of just one slave owners. And unfortunately, we know about the WPA slave narratives and things like that. We don't have that story. We don't have that good story of a person who was the only slave on a farm or in a household or something like that. We just don't have that narrative, which would be invaluable to have.
I believe I read somewhere once that, correct me if I'm wrong, that about 1850 the Ozarks led the nation in beef and swine production.
Yeah, certainly in per capita. Right. Yeah. We think of Arkansas as a hog state. I mean, we came by the Razorbacks honest, because that was certainly a big part. But in the pre-Civil War era, cattle were very plentiful, and what I did was I did a lot of statistical research for this book, and one of the things I did was figured up per capita livestock numbers, and Arkansas in particular, I think as late as 1850 led the nation in per capita cattle population. Eventually Texas and maybe even California would pass Arkansas, but certainly that was a major thing. And one of the funnest things that I got to write about in this first volume were the cattle drives, and that was a really neat. There were lots and lots of stories of pre-Civil War cattle drives within the Ozarks and from the Ozarks to other places, especially to California. The Ozarks, if you think about it, in the 1850s, we're sort of on the western edge of the United States still. This is about as far, Texas, you get over there, but so the Ozarks becomes one of the great launching places for these great cattle drives that take hundreds and hundreds of cattle to California. And people would do that because they brought so much more money in California. That's the same reason why people in the 1930s and 40s and 50s were moving to California, or they were moving to St. Louis, or where are they going? Because you could make so much more money in these places, and cattle were worth, you know, sometimes 4 or 5 times as much a head in the California gold fields as they were back here. And so I have a couple of accounts, and I have one detailed account of a cattle drive that leaves the Fayetteville area and goes all the way to California, and with hundreds of cattle. And they even pick some up on the way out there, and you know, and we've even got a pretty good idea of the route that they followed out there, and it was a process that took about 6 months. If you can imagine that, being on a 6-month cattle drive. Yeah, you talk about walking bow-legged at the end of that cattle drive. That had to be rough. But yeah, this was a major thing. And of course, the entire region was open range at that point. No one started closing any of the range until a few years after the Civil War, and it gradually closes down. Some of you may even remember when southeast Missouri still had open range up on Current River in the 60s. You know, there were places up there in the 60s where, you know, the cows are just out walking around, hogs. You know,
I graduated high school in the 90s, and I can tell you that riding a school bus in western Randolph County, there were
it was over I know what you're talking about. Yeah, and I'm pretty sure the Blevins family contributed to the open range in Hendrick County. Our fences, we may not be Scots-Irish, but we fix fence like the Scots-Irish. My grandpa's favorite saying was, you know, we're not taking this to the fair. You know, and I've been to places, and I can imagine the western part of Randolph County is probably one of those places where fences are still pretty optional. But as we found out, if you always raise your own heifers and you never bring in new stock, where are they going to go? You know, if you've got cattle bloodlines that go back many, many generations, that's home to them. They're not leaving. They don't have anywhere to go. But if you start bringing in new animals, you know, what do? They walk the fences. When you turn them out, they'll find the hole in the fence. Your own stock, they're not looking for the hole. They don't have anywhere to go. That's the key. Just don't buy any new stuff. Just buy a new bull every once in a while.
Was the old Chisholm Trail one of those cattle drives went through Albuquerque, I think, and on out?
Well, that's more of a post-Civil War kind of trail, yeah, and that doesn't involve the Ozarks directly, like these. The one cattle drive in the Ozarks that I write about in this book is one that actually takes place in southeastern Missouri up to St. Louis. And I came across this story in a diary of a guy who would eventually be a Confederate veteran, but this is before the Civil War when he's a teenager, and he participates in a cattle drive with his uncle, and he describes taking the cattle. They try to take the cattle around Potosi, but they stampede right through the heart of Potosi, and he says, we were afraid they were going to kill somebody, but they didn't. So that was a pretty matter-of-fact story of the cattle drive through Potosi, but it was some fun stuff.
Can you tell me the time, how the time that when the Irish wilderness was established fits into this?
Yeah, the Irish wilderness up in Oregon County, it comes into existence in the 1850s, so not very long, just a few years before the Civil War. And it gets its name because an Irish-American Catholic priest in St. Louis gets the idea that he wants to take some of his fellow Irish Catholics out of the slums of St. Louis and other places and settle them out in the country. Now, he probably could have found a better place than the Oregon County wilderness to do this, But he kind of fell in love with this. He was a romantic, sort of not terribly realistic. He sort of just had this romantic image of people living out in the country. He's obviously someone who had never done it himself, not in the heart of the Ozarks. And so he was able to get a hold of this land in Oregon County and settled several Irish families there. And then the Civil War came along just a few years later. And there are a couple books on the Irish wilderness and sort of speculating on what happened to the people. But we know some of the community itself basically dissolves during the Civil War, as so many communities did. But some of the people remain. Some of the names are still around after the Civil War, but the community itself doesn't survive the Civil War. I mean, these were people who just Oregon County was like Randolph County and all the other border counties. It was just a terrible place to be in the Civil War. It was not a place that was safe for anybody. It didn't matter what side you were on. It was just not a no man's land is what we call places like that. Where just a complete breakdown of law and order and killing and just a dangerous place. So that's the Cliff's Notes version of the Irish wilderness. And there was actually an earlier, going all the way back a generation earlier, there was another attempt even farther north up in Reynolds County, if you know where that is. Somebody mentioned Centerville.
Yes.
They're around Lesterville, if you know where Lesterville is. There was another Irish Catholic priest by the name of Maxwell who came up with a big chunk of land in the Lesterville area, which is on. It's around the what they call it, the Three Forks of the Black River. It's around the headwaters of the Black River up there, and he had the same vision, but it never got as far as Hogan's Irish wilderness did in Oregon County. Yeah.
All right, well, let's give Dr. Blevins a hand. I'm sure he'll answer any questions. And join us next week to hear Dr. Jan Ziegler's lecture.